Monterey Park in California is the first Taiwanese American suburb outside of Chinatown that became predominantly Asian American. In its early days, it was called Little Taipei. It was unfortunately hit by a tragic shooting that killed 11 on Lunar New Year's Eve. And today with me is a racial justice scholar and writer, Bianca Mabute-Louie, who is writing about Asian American communities in her upcoming book, Unassimilable. Well, Bianca, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me today.
We've all been very concerned about the recent shooting, about the community of Monterey Park. I know you have relatives there. Tell us, what was your first reaction when you heard about this incident?
It was kind of incomprehensible and unbelievable. I mean, there are so many mass shootings that happen now in this country with the gun epidemic that unfortunately, I think for a lot of folks, the first reaction is just kind of being numb. But I think this particular shooting, I mean, it was in Monterey Park, which is the first place where my parents ever lived when they came to this country. It was at a ballroom dance studio. And so right in the beginning, I was texting my dad and I was trying to figure out, is this the dance studio that my mom goes to every Saturday? Is it not? It sounds like it's really close. Eventually we found out that, yes, we have family and community members and family friends who attended that dance studio pretty regularly. Yeah, it was incredibly hard because it's my hometown and it's also a protected ethnic community where I grew up. And so there was a lot to process and try to make sense of.
Yeah, I think it really hits home for us who have connections to the community there, right? And many of us do who are Asian Americans. How would you say this tragedy reflects any of the trends in Asian American communities now today? For example, gun ownership has risen over 40% during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. What would you say about some of the trends like that may have been related to this shooting?
At the height of the pandemic, we saw a lot of increase in interpersonal attacks and discrimination towards Asian Americans. And people have theorized that the rise in gun ownership has to do with folks not feeling safe in their own neighborhoods. In terms of how this relates to everything that's been happening in the Asian American community, I mean, I think it adds to the trauma and the precarity and the lack of safety that we have been feeling. And at the same time, there's a lot of details about motives still coming out, but things like domestic violence, patriarchal violence, trauma from displacement, from imperialism, from war, all these things that we carry that are often hidden and not talked about have always been part of our communities, right? And so I think these times of desperation, of isolation from the pandemic, and then this just increased sense of precarity and danger maybe brings some of those things to the surface. And many have said, Min Jo, who is a scholar who has studied the San Gabriel Valley ethnoburb for a long time, talked about how for sure that the gun culture and leniency around gun ownership in this country perhaps emboldens and conditions some of what we saw last weekend.
Oh, yes, it's very unfortunate. It wouldn't have happened in Taiwan, right? Or other places where people don't have access to guns.
Right.
But I did see a statistic actually on your Twitter feed that 55% of Asian American Pacific Islander women are victims of intimate or sexual violence in their lifetime. Can you tell us more about that? Because he had met his ex-wife at the ballroom. How much is gender violence hurting the community?
Well, I think broadly speaking, even not specific to the Asian American community, one fact that we're, I think, just starting to gain more conversation about recently is, you'll have to fact check me, but overwhelmingly mass shootings have some kind of connection to domestic violence, regardless of the race or ethnicity of the perpetrator, regardless of where it happens. There's always some kind of connection, whether it is the act of violence being committed or the perpetrator's personal history. There's always some kind of component of intimate partner and domestic violence wrapped up in this epidemic of mass shootings. And so there's that context to take in mind. And then there's also the reality that, again, gender-based violence and patriarchal violence have been wounds that our community has been carrying for a long time, interpersonally in our own communities, but also thinking about how the Atlanta shooting just 2 years ago targeted Asian women. And when we look at the beginning of Asian folks coming to this country, there was a ban not only on Chinese immigrants with the Chinese Exclusion Act, but before that, there was the Page Act that specifically sexualized and fetishized and criminalized Asian women, barring them from coming into this country. And so in terms of thinking about violence and racial violence, we have to think about it as very intimately connected to patriarchal violence.
What about the issue of Asian hate, which has been a big concern of the Asian American community ever since the pandemic? I was actually in California when this happened. I was on Twitter, and I noticed before people knew who the killer was, they're afraid that it would be a race-based attack, So it seems like the community is very sensitive to any targeting and any violence against Asian Americans. Tell us more about how Asian hate has been affecting the community.
The part about the perpetrator being from our community, I want to specify that it doesn't have to be a white person who's the perpetrator to perpetuate hate against our community, that there is such a thing as intra-ethnic violence, or the violence we do to each other. At the same time, I've been trying recently to move away from the concept and framework of hate and try to understand all the interpersonal attacks of the past few years, as well as the more heinous and violent mass shootings, understand those things as rooted in systemic and state violence, that it isn't just hate, which is something that we imply as interpersonal, right? It is the bias in someone's opinion or in their heart towards a certain group. But actually, these things that we're seeing, the interpersonal attacks, are rooted in what we saw as the systematic scapegoating of Asians for diseases that we saw throughout history, and also most recently in the pandemic. And then the larger scapegoating that we see in this country, for example, the ways that immigrants get scapegoated for unemployment or crime or other social ills. All of these phenomena are forms of state violence. And state violence also includes things like deportation and war and the factors that push people to have to leave their countries to come here. And then to come here and experience things like labor exploitation, and then this culture around gun violence and the leniency around gun ownership. All of these different big social structures that I'm naming are all part of what creates hate. And so when we just limit our conversation to hate, I think that prevents us from, again, seeing the bigger picture, that a lot of this is policy-based and structural. And so when we look at the past few years, as well as from this past weekend, all of these things work together.
Well, let's talk more about Monterey Park. I know that you have family there, right? Your grandparents were there, and it's the first Asian American. Also, it's connected to Taiwan too, because a lot of Taiwan immigrants moved there. What was it like for you when you went to Monterey Park growing up?
Yeah, well, I always tell the story of my grandmother there on my mom's side, my pawpaw. She actually immigrated after we did, so she came in her 70s. After she got divorced. She didn't speak English. She didn't really know anyone besides us. She didn't have a car, which, if you are familiar with Southern California, very difficult to get around without a car. And so she was kind of set up, under very difficult circumstances with very few safety nets. And yet, I always say the ethnoburb kind of saved her and emboldened her. So in her 70s, into her 80s, she had a pretty thriving social life. She lived on her own in this apartment complex with other Cantonese elders. They gossiped all the time. They played mahjong. They had a Cantonese church that they went to where she got baptized. She had she could walk across the street and go to 85 degrees and get, her morning bow, None of this could have been possible if it weren't for the ethnoburb and this infrastructure and social safety net that immigrants who had come before us had set up for us and for each other. And so what it was like for me to grow up there, it was a place where, my family rarely, if ever, spoke English if we were in San Gabriel Valley. We only ate Chinese food, and we got our Chinese groceries, and my parents spoke exclusively Cantonese when we were there. And so I didn't go to school there. I mostly went to predominantly white schools in Pasadena outside of San Gabriel Valley. And so for me, it was really important for me to grow up there where I had this space where I saw Asians didn't need to assimilate and could still thrive and beautiful community with each other.
So what is it that inspired you to write your book, Unassimilable?
Part of it is that story of my grandmother. I think a lot of it is responding to how we talk about Asian Americans and Asian American politics today. A lot of it I see is, us hustling and striving and laboring to try to prove our belonging to this country and to prove that we are American enough, that we are patriotic enough. And we've seen this throughout history where Asians had to prove their patriotism just to survive and not be criminalized and surveilled by the state. And at the same time, when you look at the ethnoburb, you see this contrasting example where here are Asians who are not going to assimilate. In fact, they created this ethnoburb because they had faced barriers accessing white neighborhoods and white spaces. So they created their own space that catered exclusively to each other. And so when you drive around, there are signs in Chinese and Vietnamese. And they created this ecosystem, again, where they could thrive without catering to whiteness. And so that basis and the example of the ethnoburb is the foundation of my book to argue for and propose the question of what it look like for us as Asian Americans to, instead of striving and trying to prove our belonging to this country that is so fickle and seems to only want our labor, but never really want us, right? What would it look like actually to just build our own spaces of being unassimilable and thrive by really building community for and with each other?
Well, what would you like America to know about the Asian American community?
That's a big question.
I mean, what kind of insight would you like or to share or help them understand? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding or stereotypes, right, between races. And
I think, just by looking at the ethnoburb, you can see the diversity of our community. A lot of people talk about how there's the model minority myth and the assumption that all Asians are very upper middle class. But if you take a deeper dive into the ethnoburb, you can see actually that we're very linguistically diverse, ethnically diverse, and socioeconomically diverse. We're very diverse in the reasons and pathways of how and why we get here to this country. And on top of that, we, are very resilient to build our own communities. And I'm starting to try to accept this more, but part of our humanity means we are also vulnerable and human, right? That there is intergenerational trauma, there is intra-ethnic violence, domestic violence, just like any other community, that I think these moments really demand us to reckon with and think sensitively about, because again, these aren't Asian issues, but these are just kind of human issues in any community, even in thriving ethnic enclaves. The pain, has to get metabolized and alchemized somehow, right? Mm-hmm.
So do you plan to live in an ethnic enclave when you graduate? I know you're still doing your PhD, right?
I don't know yet. I wouldn't be opposed to it. I mean, my family is still there and there's a lot of compelling reasons too. I'm in Houston now. And actually one thing interesting is I do see in the South and Midwest, there are more and more ethnic enclaves and Asian ethnoburbs, very similar to San Gabriel Valley, sprouting out in other parts of the country. So, as this country becomes demographically more diverse and non-white, I think it's only natural that we're going to see more and more spaces actually like SGV.
I've been speaking with racial justice scholar and writer Bianca Mabute-Louie, who is writing about Asian American communities in her upcoming book, Unassimilable.